Welcome to The Explainer. All right, today we're tackling a big one, corporate accountability. We're going to break down how the law even begins to handle multinational corporations, these giants that operate all over the world. This is where things get really interesting. It's the intersection of global business, ethics, and of course, the law itself.
So let's just jump right in with the central question, right? What happens when a global corporation gets so powerful that its sense of responsibility can't keep up? How does the law even begin to react? This is, without a doubt, one of the biggest challenges in modern corporate law. I mean, how do you apply your legal rulebook to a player that doesn't just operate in one country, but in dozens of them all at once? It's this constant, high-stakes game of catch. Okay, so before we dive into the really complex cases and conflicts, we've got to lay the groundwork. You know this from your studies. Getting the first principles right, the core definitions, is absolutely everything. So let's establish the ground rules.
First up, the multinational corporation, or MNC. What are we actually talking about here? Well, think of the big names, right? Your Apples, your Coca-Colas. These aren't just businesses. They're massive global operations. And because their reach is global, their legal footprint and all the responsibilities that come with it is just as massive and, frankly, incredibly complex. And that brings us to the key concept, liability. What is it really? At its core, you can think of it as the legal glue that sticks an action to its consequence. If a company does something that causes harm, liability is the legal mechanism that says, hey, you're responsible for this. You have to fix it or pay for it. It's how the law makes accountability a real thing. All right, definitions are down. So now let's see how this all plays out in the real world. To really get a grip on liability, we need to look at the main arenas where these companies get into trouble. You can think of it like we're building a case file, section by section. And that case file is generally broken down into 4 key areas of harm. We've got environmental harm, harm to workers, harm to consumers, and economic harm. Now, these can definitely overlap, but each one brings its own unique set of legal challenges to the table. Let's start with environmental harm. This is a pretty straightforward example, right? A factory dumps chemicals into a river. The water gets polluted, wildlife suffers. In a legal sense, this is where you often see the polluter pays principle kick in. The cause and effect here is crystal clear, so the liability is direct. The legal system's main goal? Make the company clean up its own mess. Next up, harm to workers. Now, for anyone studying law, this is bread and butter stuff. It all comes down to the duty of care a company has towards its employees. If they breach that duty, say by creating unsafe conditions, and someone gets hurt, boom, liability is triggered. This is fundamental tort and employment law, but applied on a massive global scale. And then you've got harm to consumers, which this example with the toy company illustrates perfectly. This is all about product liability. A corporation's responsibility doesn't just stop at the cash register. Nope, it follows the product all the way to the end user. The company is on the hook for making sure its products are actually safe for people to use. Finally, there's economic harm. And this one's tricky. It's not as obvious as a polluted river or a faulty product. We're talking about things like complex tax avoidance schemes where profits are shifted around the globe. The harm isn't physical, but trust me, the impact on a country's economy can be absolutely devastating. This is where corporate law gets tangled up with some really complex international tax law. Okay, so we've laid out the different ways things can go wrong. Now let's talk about the legal response. What's actually in the toolbox for enforcing accountability? How do legal systems around the world try to make these massive corporations answer for their actions? Broadly speaking, it comes down to 3 main things: lawsuits, fines and penalties, and then the big picture stuff, international laws and treaties. Each of these tools has a different job, whether it's getting compensation for victims, punishing the company, or trying to set some ground rules for everyone. And it's really useful to think about the difference between lawsuits and fines. On the one hand, you've got lawsuits. These are usually started by the people who are actually harmed. Their goal? Compensation mostly, making things right. On the other hand, you have fines, which are typically slapped on by government regulators. The goal there is totally different. It's about punishment and, maybe more importantly, scaring other companies from doing the same thing. You absolutely need both. And then we zoom out to the global level. This is where international laws and treaties come into play. Now, why are these so important? Well, think about it. An MNC operates in, say, 50 different countries with 50 different legal systems. These treaties are an attempt, and I do stress attempt, to create one consistent set of rules, especially for big issues like human rights and the environment. They're trying to stop companies from jurisdiction shopping and exploiting legal loopholes. But as you can imagine, actually enforcing these treaties, that's a whole other can of worms. So, we've talked a lot about what happens after the damage is done, but ideally, we wouldn't get to that point, right? The real goal of good corporate law is to get companies to be proactive, to stop the harm from ever happening in the first place. So, how does a company actually do that? How do they avoid liability? It really boils down to a three-part framework. First, you've got the absolute baseline. Rigorously follow the law, both local and international. No shortcuts. Second, you have to go beyond just what's legally required and actually act responsibly. We're talking about a real commitment to not harming people or the planet. And third, and this is crucial, you need strong internal policies. An ethical code that's not just a piece of paper, but is actually enforced from the top down. You take away any one of those pillars, and the whole thing comes crashing down. All right, let's wrap this up with a final thought on the future. When you boil it all down, what we've been talking about is a very old principle, right? With great power comes great responsibility. The twist here is that it's legally enforceable responsibility. And all those doctrines of liability we've discussed, those are the tools that make sure that principle isn't just a nice idea, but a reality. Which leaves us with the big, lingering question. Corporations are only getting more powerful, more complex, and more global. So are the legal frameworks we have right now actually strong enough to handle what's coming next? Honestly, that's the question that your generation of legal professionals is going to have to answer. Because as these companies evolve, the law has no choice but to evolve right along with them. Thanks so much for joining me for this Explain.